Part II, Chapters 26 and 27 of How I Filmed the War, by Geoffrey H. Malins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26: An Uncanny Adventure. Lieutenant B, the official still photographer, and I have been companions in a few strange enterprises in the war. But I doubt whether any have equalled in strangeness, and I might say almost uncanny adventure, that which I am about to record. In cold type it would be pardonable for anyone to disbelieve some of the facts set forth, but as I have proved for myself the perfect application of the well-known saying that truth is stranger than fiction, I merely relate the facts in simple language exactly as they happened, and leave them to speak for themselves. It was early morning on March 17th, 1917, when the Germans began their headlong flight towards their Cambrai-Saint-Quentin or Hindenburg line. When B and I hastened along the main Saint-Quentin road, troops and transports were as usual everywhere. We passed through the ruined villages of Foscaucourt and Estrées, and brought our car to a standstill about 2 kilometres from the village of Villers-Carbonel, it being impossible owing to the fearful road conditions to proceed further. We left the car and started off to explore the unknown. On either side of the road I noticed many troops in their trenches. They were looking down at us as if we were something out of the ordinary, until I turned to him and said, "Is there anything funny about us? These chaps seem to be highly interested in our appearance or something. What is it?" "I don't know," he said. "Let's inquire." So, going up to an R.A.M.C. officer who was standing outside his dug out, I asked him if there was any news. In fact, I inquired whether there was a war on up there. Everything seemed to be so absolutely quiet. "Well," he said, "there was up to about 3 hours ago. Bosche has fairly plastered us with 5.9 and whiz bangs. These suddenly ceased, and as a matter of fact I began to wonder whether peace had been declared when your car came bounding up the road. How the devil did you manage it? Yesterday evening the act of putting one's head over the parapet was enough to draw a few shells, but you come sailing up here in a car." "This is about the most charming joy ride I have had for many a day," I replied. "But let me introduce myself. I am Malins, the official kinematographer, and my friend here is the official still picture man. We are here to get scenes of the German retreat, but it seems to me that one cannot see Bosche for dust. That is Villers-Carbonel, is it not?" I said, pointing up the road in the distance. "Yes," he replied. "Right," I said. "We are going there, and on our way back we'll tell you all the news." With a cheery wave of the hand he bade us adieu, and we started on our journey. The once beautiful trees which lined the sides of the road were torn to shreds and, in some instances, were completely cut in half by shell fire, and the trunks were strewn across the road. These and the enormous shell holes made it difficult to proceed at all, but by clambering over the huge tree trunks, in and out of filthy slime-filled shell holes, and nearly tearing oneself to pieces on the barbed wire intermingled with broken branches, we managed at last to reach the village. Not a sound was to be heard. I turned to my companion. "This is an extraordinary state of affairs, isn't it? In case there are any Bosche rearguard patrols, we'll keep this side of the ruins as much as possible." The village was practically on the top of a ridge of hills. I stood under the shadow of some tree stumps and gazed around. What a scene of desolation it was! I got my camera into action and took some excellent scenes, showing what was once a beautiful main road. Broken trees flung over it in all directions like so many wisps of straw, and an unimaginable mass of barbed wire entanglements. Then, swinging my camera round, I obtained a panoramic view of the destroyed village. Dotted here and there were the dead bodies of horses and men. How long they had lain there, Heaven knows. While examining the ruins of a building which used to be a bakehouse, I received a startling surprise. I was bending down and looking into an empty oven, when, with a rush and a clatter, a fine black cat sprang at my legs with a frightened, piteous look in its eyes, and mewed in a strange manner. For the moment I was startled, for the animal clung to my breeches. The poor creature looked half starved. In its frenzy it might bite or scratch my leg or hand. Blood poisoning would be likely to follow. I gently lowered my gloved hand and caressed its head. With a soft purr it relaxed its hold of my leg and dropped to the ground. Feeling more comfortable, I unfastened my satchel and, taking out some biscuits, gave them to the poor brute. It ravenously ate them up. My second surprise was to come. A faint scratching and mewing sound came from behind some bread bins in a corner, and as I looked, the black cat sprang forward with a biscuit in its mouth in the direction of the sound. I followed and gently moved the bin aside. The sight there almost brought tears into my eyes. Lying upon some old rags and straw were 3 tiny kittens. 2 were struggling around the mother cat, mewing piteously and trying to nibble at the biscuit she had brought. The other was dead. The mother cat looked up at me with eyes which were almost human in their expression of thanks. I took out some more biscuits, and breaking them up in an empty tin I picked up from the floor, I poured some water from my bottle on to them, placed it beside the starving group, and, leaving a handful near the mother cat, I made their retreat as snug as possible. Making our way again to the main road, I stood by some ruins and looked away in the distance where the Germans had disappeared. What a difference! Here were green fields, gorgeous woods, hills and dales with winding roads sweeping away out of sight. It reminded me of the feeling Moses must have experienced when he looked upon the promised land. Here were no shell-torn fields, no woods beaten out of all semblance to anything, no earth upon which thousands of men had poured out their blood, but here in front of us a veritable heaven. "Come along," I said, "let's explore. If there are any Bosches about, they'll soon let us know of their presence. Let's get on to that other ridge, the Somme river should be there somewhere." We left the village and cautiously followed the road, down one hill and up the next. The Germans had disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed them up. Not a soul was to be seen. We might have been strolling on the Surrey hills. I gradually reached the brow of the next ridge. The sight which met my eyes was the most stimulating one I had ever seen from a picture point of view. There, in front of us, at a distance of 600 yards, was the river Somme, the name which will go down to history as the most momentous in this, the bloodiest war the world has ever known. There it glistened, winding its way north and south like a silver snake. "Come along," I said. "I shall get the first picture of the Somme," and we raced away down the road. In calmer moments at home I have admitted that we were mad. Nobody in their right senses would have done such a thing as to rush headlong into country which might have been thick with enemy snipers and machine guns. But the quietness of the grave reigned. Not a rifle shot disturbed the silence. Evidence of the German retreat met our gaze as we ran down the road. On either side were discarded material, and in a quarry on the left a German Red Cross sign was stuck up on a post, and several dugouts were burning. Smoke was pouring up from below, showing that the Hun was destroying everything. I was brought to a standstill at the sight of a mass of wreckage near the river. Smoke was issuing from it. I looked on my map and saw that it was the village of Brie. A small section was this side of the river, but the main part was on the other side. The whole place had been completely destroyed, partly, I ultimately found out, by our gunfire, and the remainder burnt or blown up by the Germans. The river had developed into a swampy marsh. In fact, it was very difficult to say precisely where the river and canal finished and the marshes began. I again got my camera into action and filmed, for the first time, the Somme river, which was directly in our line of advance. The bridges were blown up. Huge masses of stone and iron, twisted and torn and flung into the morass of weeds and mud and water, forming small dams, thus diverting the river in all directions. Several scenes on this historic spot I filmed, then, wishing to push forward, I attempted to cross the broken bridges. By careful manoeuvring I managed to cross the first, then the second, but a large gap blown in the roadway about 40 feet across, through which the water rushed in a torrent, brought me to a standstill, so reluctantly I had to retrace my steps. Except for the sound of rushing water, the quietness was almost uncanny. The excitement of the chase was over. Then I began to realise our position. We were in a section of ground which the enemy had occupied only a few hours before and had apparently abandoned, vanished into thin air. We were at least 2 kilometres in front of our infantry. In fact, we had, of our own accord, keen on obtaining live scenes for the people at home, constituted ourselves an advance patrol, armed not with machine guns, swords, or lances, but with cameras. There was every possibility of our being taken for Germans ourselves by our men from a distance. The real advance guard coming up would undoubtedly open fire and enquire into credentials afterwards. The ruins across the bridge might hide enemy rifles. They might open fire any moment. I explained the situation to my companion, who had also presumably reached a decision very similar to my own, which was to return to the village of Villers Carbonel as quickly and as carefully as possible. Keeping to the side of the road, we trudged back, and half way up the hill we ran into one of the things I expected, an advance party. An officer came forward and said in astonished tones, "Where the devil have you fellows come from?" "We've been getting photographs of the German retreat," I replied. "We're the official photographers, and have been half way across the Somme, but owing to the bridge being blown up, we have come back. The Germans seem to have vanished entirely. Not a sign of one about anywhere." "Well, I'm ," he said. "This is the funniest thing I've ever known. Will our advance patrols constitute the official photographers for the future? If so, it will save us any amount of trouble." "Well," I said, "you can go on. Devil a Bosche is over there anyway." "Well," he said, "these troops I am taking down will be the first across the Somme." "Right," I said, seeing immediately the scoop it would be for my film. "I will come back and film your men going over. It will make a unique picture." With that we retraced our steps, and laughing and chatting about our adventure, we once again reached the Somme river. I fixed up my camera, and when all was ready, a rough bridge was hastily made of several planks lashed together to bridge gaps in the fallen stonework, and I filmed the first troops to cross the Somme during the great German retreat. The light was now failing, so packing up my apparatus and waving farewells to the C.O., I turned back again. B joined me. The day had been a great one for us, and we mutually agreed that it was a fitting sequel to the first British battle that had ever been filmed, which I took at Beaumont-Hamel on July 1st, 1916. Weary in body but very much alive mentally, we returned via Villers Carbonel to our car. On my way back I wondered how the cat and her kittens were getting on. The black cat had certainly brought me luck. Chapter XXVII. The Germans in Retreat. To keep in touch with all the happenings on that section of the front for which I was responsible, and to obtain a comprehensive record of events, it was necessary to keep very wide awake. Movements, definite and indefinite, were taking place in scores of different places at the same moment. To keep in touch with the enemy, to work with our forward patrols, to enter upon the heels of our advance guard into the evacuated villages, and, if possible, to get there first and film their triumphal entry, film our advance infantry and guns taking up new positions, the engineers at work remaking the roads, building new bridges over the Somme, laying down new railways and repairing old ones, the 101 different organisations that were working and straining every muscle and nerve for the common cause. Only the favoured few had the remotest idea of the enormous amount of work to be done under such conditions. The road, which was no man's land yesterday morning, to the village of Villers Carbonel was now swarming with men clearing away the accumulated débris of the battlefield. Tree trunks were moved off the road, shell holes were being filled up with bricks and branches, trenches which crossed the road were being filled in, a tank trap at the entrance to the village, the shape of a broad, deep ditch, about 30 by 20 feet wide by 15 feet deep, was being loaded with tree trunks and earth. I filmed these scenes, then hurried as fast as possible in the direction of Brie to cover the advanced work on the Somme, and then to cross to the other side and get in touch with our cavalry patrols. What an extraordinary change in the place! Yesterday a ghostly silence reigned. Now men and material and transport were swarming everywhere. I reached the river. The engineers had thrown up light temporary bridges, 6 in all. Huge iron girders had arrived from back behind. They had been made in readiness for the day. Our H.Q. had known that the Germans in their inevitable retreat would destroy the bridges, so to save time, duplicates were built in sections ready to throw across the gap. I managed to arrive in time to film several squadrons of the Duke of Lancaster's cavalry hurrying forward to harass the enemy. Cyclist patrols were making their way over. I hurried as fast as possible through the ruins of Brie and on to the ridge beyond. In the distance I watched our cavalry deploying in extended order and advanced towards a wood to clear it of the enemy rear guards. Motorcyclists with their machine guns were dashing up the hill, anxious to get into contact with the flying enemy. I filmed many scenes in this section. I looked along the road which was the main one into St. Quentin. It stretched away as far as the eye could see. The condition is certainly excellent, I thought. There would be a greater possibility of obtaining exciting scenes if it were possible to proceed in my car. The only question was whether the temporary bridges across the Somme were capable of sustaining the weight. The possibility of getting into villages just evacuated by the Germans spurred me on. So, retracing my steps, I reached the river again. "Do you think the bridge will take the weight of my car?" I asked an officer in charge of engineers. "What is it?" "Daimler," I replied. "Well," he said, "there is a risk, of course, but our GS wagons have been across and also the artillery, so they may take your bus, if you don't bounce her in crossing." "Righto," I said, "I will get it down." Hurrying across, I had just reached the last bridge, when with a sudden snap one of the main beams gave way. All traffic was, of course, stopped, and engineers quickly got to work replacing the broken girder. "It will be at least another hour, sir," said a sergeant in answer to my enquiry. So there was nothing for it but to curb my impatience and wait, and I stood my apparatus down and watched the proceedings. At that moment a car came to a standstill alongside me. "What's wrong?" called out one of the occupants. "Broken bridge," I said. "I'm waiting to cross with my car to get films of the villages and occupants." "That's good," said the speaker, a captain. "I am going up to them as well. Intelligence I heard from our airmen this morning that they saw civilians in one or two villages a few miles out, so I'm off to investigate. Would you care to come? We shall be the first there." "Yes, rather," I replied. "It will be a fine scoop for me to film the first meeting of British troops in the liberated villages. I will follow in my car." The bridge was again complete, so, dumping my camera aboard, I followed in the wake of the captain. Up the hill we dashed and spun along the road at the top, passing beyond the outskirts of Brie. We were now beyond the extreme limit of the shelling which we had subjected the Germans to during their months of occupation. I was now beginning to see the sights and view the atrocious system and regularity of wilful destruction which had obviously been planned months before by the Huns to carry out Hindenburg's orders and make the whole land a desert. Not a tree was standing. Whole orchards were hewn down. Every fruit tree and bush was destroyed. Hedges were cut at the base as if with a razor. Even those surrounding cemeteries were treated in the same way. Agricultural implements were smashed. Mons-en-Chaussée was the first village we entered. Every house was a blackened, smoking ruin, and where the fiends had not done their work with fire, they had brought dynamite to their aid. Whole blocks of buildings had been blown into the air. There was not sufficient cover for a dog. The car suddenly came to a standstill. My driver jammed on his brake, and I hurried forward. There, at the middle of the village crossroads, was another enormous mine crater, 100 feet across by about 60 feet deep. It was quite impassable, but the sight which astounded me was to see about 20 old women and children running up the road the other side of the crater, shouting and waving their arms with joy. "Les Anglais! Les Anglais!" they yelled. I got my camera into position and filmed the captain and his companions as they clambered round the jagged lip of the crater and were embraced by the excited people. For the first time since their captivity by the Germans they had seen "Les Anglais." Liberators and captives met. Several scenes I filmed of the enormous crater and of the cut down fruit trees. Not a single tree, old or young, was left standing. To blow up roads and hew down telegraph poles was war, and such measures are justified. But to destroy every tree or bush that could possibly bear fruit, wilfully to smash up agricultural implements, to shoot a dog and tie a label to its poor body written in English, "Tommies, don't forget to put this in your next communiqué, that we killed one dog. Signed, the Huns." To crucify a cat upon a door and stick a cigar in its mouth, to blow up and poison wells, to desecrate graves, to smash open vaults and rob the corpses which lay there, and then to kick the bones in all directions and use the coffins as cesspools, these things I have seen with my own eyes. Is this war? It is the work of savages, ghouls, fiends. I wondered where these people had come from, and where they had been as the whole village was burnt out. I inquired and found that the Germans 2 days before had cleared the village of its population and distributed them in villages further back, and had then set fire to the place, leaving nothing but a desert behind, and taking with them all the men who could work, and many girls in their teens, to what fate one may guess. These few villagers had wandered back during the day to gaze upon the wreckage of their homes, and arrived just in time to meet us at the crater. "We will get along," said my companion. "I want to visit Bovincourt and Vraignes before nightfall, though I am afraid we shall not do it. By making a detour round these ruins I believe we shall strike the main road further down." I followed him through the ruins, and after bouncing over innumerable bricks and beams we reached the main road. We passed through Estrées-en-Chaussée. One large barn was only standing. Everything was as quiet as the grave. Columns of smoke were still rising from the ruins. Another jamming on of brakes brought us to a standstill at a cross roads. Another huge mine crater was in front of us, and it was most difficult to see until we were well upon it. There was nothing to do but to take to the fields. Our road was at right angles to the one we were traversing. I examined the ground. It was very soft, and the newly scattered earth and clay from the mine made it much worse. If we get stuck, I thought, there is nobody about to help us out. The captain tried and got over. I yelled out that I would follow. They disappeared in the direction of Bovincourt. Backing my car to get a good start, I let it go over the edge of the road into the field. It was like going through pudding. The near wheels roared round without gripping. Then it happened. We were stuck. A fine predicament, I thought, with prowling enemy patrols about and no rifle. "All shoulders to the wheel," I said. By digging and jamming wood, sacking and straw under the wheels, we managed, after 3/4 of an hour, to get it out. Jove, what a time it was! And so on the road again. "We will get into Bovincourt," I said. "Let her go. I may meet the others." The feeling was uncanny and my position strange. For all I knew, Bosches were all around me, and later on this proved to be the case. Night was falling, and ere I reached the village it was quite impossible to take any scenes. At the entrance to the village I ran into several people who crowded round the car, crying and laughing in their relief at seeing the British arrive. Old men and women who could barely move hobbled forward to shake hands, with tears in their eyes. They clambered in and around the car, and it was only by making them understand that I would return on the following day that they allowed the car to proceed. The sight was wonderful, and I wish I were able to describe it better. I could not find the other car, so, assuming it had gone back, I decided to return as far as Brie and stay the night. As I was leaving the village, a burst of machine gun fire rang out close by, followed by violent rifle shots. "Let her go," I said to my chauffeur. "I am not at all anxious to get pipped out here. My films must not fall into enemy hands." The car shot up the road like a streak. The mine crater was ahead, and the possibility of getting stuck again whilst crossing made me feel anything but easy. "Full tilt," I told my driver. "We must trust to speed to get across." On went the lower gear. A right hand twist of the wheel and we were on the field. The speed gradually grew less. The back wheels buzzed round, but still gripped a little. "Keep her going at all costs," I yelled. "If the car sticks here it will have to be left." To lighten her a little, I jumped out and pushed up behind for all I was worth. Mud was flying in all directions. We were nearly across. Another 20 yards. With a final roll and screech she bounded off on to the road. I jumped aboard again, and up the road we shot towards Mons. If the Hun patrols had been anywhere near, they must have thought a battalion of tanks were on their track, for the noise my old bus made getting across that field was positively deafening. On I went through Mons into the ruins of its houses, still glowing red, and in some places flames were licking around the poor skeletons of its once prosperous farms. One more mine crater to negotiate, then all would be plain sailing. It was now quite dark. I dared not use lights, not even side lamps, and going was decidedly slow and risky in consequence. I sat in the bonnet of the car and, peering ahead, called out the direction. Shortly a lightish mass loomed up only a few yards distant. "Stop!" I yelled. On went the brakes, and only just in time. We came to a standstill on the outer lip of a huge crater. Another 2 yards and I should have been trying to emulate the antics of a tank in sliding down a crater and crawling up the other side. In my case the sliding down would have been all right, but coming up the other side would have been on the lap of the gods. 100 men with ropes and myself well, but that's another story. "Back the car and give it a good run," I said, "and let us lighten it as much as possible." And soon all was ready. "I will go ahead and put my handkerchief over my electric light. We must risk being seen. You head direct for the glow." I went into the muddy fields. "Let her go," I shouted. With a whir and a grind I could tell it had started. I stood still. It was coming nearer. Ye gods, what a row! Then suddenly the engines stopped and dead silence reigned. "It's stuck, sir," came a voice from the darkness. I went to the car and switched my lamp on to the near wheels. The car was stuck right up to the axle. "We shall never get out of this unaided," I said. "Put all the stuff back inside and get the hood up. We shall have to sleep here to night." Then, to add to the discomfiture of the situation, it began to rain, and rain like fury, and in a few minutes I was wet through to the skin. The hood leaked badly, and had convenient holes in alignment to one's body, whether you were sitting lengthwise or otherwise inside. I had resigned myself for a dismal night out. 2 hours had passed when I heard the clatter of hoofs coming toward me in the distance, and, by the direction of the sound, I could tell they were our men. I tumbled out and ran as fast as possible to the other side of the crater, and reached there just as the horsemen arrived. "Hullo!" I shouted. "Hullo!" came the reply. "Who is it?" "I am badly stuck, or rather my car is, in the mud in the field here. Can you hitch 2 or 3 of your horses on and help me out to the road?" "Certainly, if we can, sir." "I will guide you with my lamp. By the way, where are you going?" I said. "We are trying to get into touch with the Bosches." "I have been in Bovincourt," I said, "but there are none there, though I heard a lot of rifle fire just outside the village." We arrived at the car, and, quickly hitching on a rope, the engine was started up, and with a heave and a screech it moved forward and was eventually dragged on to the road. Thank heaven, I thought. Then, thanking the men and warning them of the other delightful mine crater further down, I started off again, sitting on the bonnet. As I neared Brie I switched on my lamp as a headlight and got held up by 2 sentries with their bayonets at the ready. They did not understand why a motor car should be coming back apparently from the German lines, and their attitude was decidedly unfriendly, till I assured them I was not a German, but only the official kinematographer out for pictures. End of Part 2, Chapters 26 and 27. Part 2, Chapter 28 of How I Filmed the War, by Geoffrey H. Malins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. The story of an armoured car, about which I could a tale unfold. To keep hard upon the heels of the retreating Germans, and so obtain scenes, the character of which had never been presented before to the British public, was my chief aim. I had no time for sleep. I arrived at my base wet through. The rain had continued throughout the whole of my return journey. Changing into dry underwear, I refilled my exposed spool boxes and packed up a good surplus supply, sufficient to last for several days. Then, packing my knapsack with the usual rations, bully and bread, condensed milk and slabs of chocolate, I was ready to start out once more. My clothes had by this time dried. Daylight was breaking, the car arrived, and with all kit aboard I started out again for the Somme, wondering what the day would bring forth. I stopped on the way to pick up the still photographer. "Where for today?" he asked. "Bovincourt and Vraignes," I replied, "and if possible one or two of the villages near by. I must get into them before our troops, so as to be able to film their entry. Does that suggest possibilities to you?" I said with a smile, knowing that he, like myself, would go through anything to obtain pictures. "Possibilities?" he said. "Don't you make my mouth water. How about food? Shall we take some to the villages?" "Excellent idea," I said. We stopped on the way and purchased a good supply of white bread and French sausages, thinking that these two commodities would be most useful. Through Foucault-Courtestray and Villers-Carbonel the roads were lined with troops, guns, and transport of every description, all making their way forward. Engineers were hard at work on the roads. Shell holes were filled in and road trenches bridged. Work was being pushed forward with an energy and skill which reflected great credit upon those in charge. Traffic controls were at crossroads which 48 hours before had been no man's land. Hun signboards were taken down and familiar British names took their place. The sight was wonderful. En route I stopped and filmed various scenes. Arriving again at Brie on the Somme, the change in affairs was astounding. The place was alive with men. It was a veritable hive of industry. New lines were being laid to replace the torn and twisted rails left by the Germans. Bridges were being strengthened, roads on both sides were widened, and to make it possible to continue the work throughout the night, a searchlight was being mounted upon a platform. Crossing the bridges of Brie, we mounted the hill and were once again upon the ridge. Great gaps had been made by our men in the huge line of barbed wire entanglements which the Huns had spent months of laborious work to construct. It stretched away over hill and dale on both sides as far as the eye could see. To pick up further information I stopped a cyclist officer coming from the direction of Mons. "Any news?" I enquired. "Where is Bosche?" "We were in touch with his rearguards all last night," he said. "They have made several strong points round the villages of Vraignes, Haucourt and Bierne. They were scouting around Vraignes, but we quickly put the wind up them," he said with a smile. "Several villages were seen burning during the night, and the enemy put a little shrapnel around some patrols near Pouilly, but no damage was done." "Vraignes, of course, is quite clear?" "Yes, as far as we know. Our patrols reported it clear late last evening, but possibly Bosche returned during the night. We captured 3 Bosche, and they have an extraordinary tale of seeing 2 armoured cars yesterday evening near Bovincourt, and they insisted upon it, although I am quite aware there were none at all near there. They say that about 6 o'clock they were on the outskirts of Bovincourt when 2 armoured cars came in sight. Not having a machine gun with them, they decided to hide, and so took cover in the ruins of a house. Later on, they say, they saw only 1 car leave in the direction of the main road. That's their tale, and they seem quite serious about it." "Well," I said with a grin, "do you think this car of mine would look like an armoured car at a distance?" "Well, yes, possibly, in a failing light. Why?" "Well, this must be one of your excellent prisoner's so-called armoured cars, because I was in Bovincourt with of the Corps Intelligence, hence the 2 cars. I missed him through getting stuck in the mud, and entered Bovincourt about 6 o'clock, and left by myself later as a skirmish was taking place somewhere near by, and not being armed with anything more dangerous than a camera, I decided to quit. I am much obliged to the Bosche for taking this bus of mine for an armoured car." With a laugh and a cheery adieu, the officer bade me good luck and pedalled off. I could not help thinking that I had had a lucky escape. On again, and reaching the first mine, the scene of the previous night's adventure, I put the car to the field at a rush, and by some extraordinary means got her round. I was just entering the village when, with a shriek and a crash, a shell burst near the church. I stopped the car, and under cover of the ruins reached a distance of about 300 yards from where it fell. If any more were coming over, I intended, if possible, to film them bursting. Carefully taking cover behind a wall, I fitted up my camera. Another shell came hurtling over and dropped and burst quite near the previous spot. Showers of bricks flew in all directions, liberally splattering the wall behind which I was concealed. The débris cleared, up went my camera, and standing by the handle I awaited the next. It came soon enough. I heard the shriek nearer and nearer. I turned the handle and put my head close behind the camera with my eye to the viewfinder. Crash came the shell, and with a terrific report it exploded. The whole side of a house disappeared, and bricks, wood, and metal flew in all directions. I continued to turn when, with an ugly little whistle, a small piece of something struck my viewfinder and another my tripod. Luckily nothing touched the lens. I awaited the next. It was longer this time, but it came, and nearer to me than the previous one. I was satisfied. I thought if they elevated another 50 yards I might get a much too close view of a shell burst, so scrambled aboard the car and made a detour round the mine on to the road beyond. "Those scenes ought to be very fine," I said. "It's one of those lucky chances where one has to take the risk of obtaining a thrilling scene." By the balls of white smoke I could see that shrapnel was bursting in the near distance. "That's near Pouilly," I said. "We are turning up on the left. Let's hope the Huns don't plaster us there." Reaching the village of Bovincourt, the villagers were there eagerly awaiting our arrival. They again crowded around the car, and it was with difficulty that I persuaded them to let us pass into the village. Cheering, shouting, and laughing, they followed close behind. I stopped the car and asked an old man, who, by his ribbons, had been through the 1870 war, "Where is the mayor?" "There is no mayor, monsieur, but a mayoress, and she is there," pointing to a buxom French peasant woman about 50 years of age. I went up to her and explained in my best French that I had brought bread and sausages for the people. Would she share them out? "Oui, oui, monsieur." "I would like you to do it here. I will then take a kinematograph film of the proceeding, so that the people in England can see it." "Ah, monsieur, it is the first white bread and good French sausage we have seen since the Boche came. They took everything from us, everything, and if it had not been for the American relief we should have starved. They are brutes, pig brutes, monsieur. They kill everything." And with tears in her eyes she told me how the Huns shot her beautiful dog because, in its joyfulness, it used to play with and bark at the children. "They did not like being disturbed, monsieur, so they shot him. Poor Jacques! They have not left one single animal. Everything has gone. Mon Dieu, but they shall suffer." I changed the painful subject by saying that now the British had driven back the Boche, everything would be quite all right. With a wan smile she agreed. I set up my camera, and telling my man to hand over the food, the mayoress shared it out. 1 sausage and a piece of white bread to each person, men, women, and children. The joy on their faces was wonderful to behold. As they received their share, they ran off to the shelter of some ruins, or up into the church, to cook their wonderful gifts. I filmed the scene, and I shall never forget it. The last of the batch had disappeared, when up the road came hobbling a woman whose age, I should say, was somewhere about 45. I could see she was on the point of exhaustion. She had a huge bundle upon her back and a child in her arms, another about 7 years clinging to her skirts. They halted outside the ruins of a cottage. The woman dropped her bundle, and crouching down upon it, clung convulsively to the babe in her arms and burst into tears. I went up to her and gently asked her the cause. "This, monsieur, was my house. 2 days past the Germans drove me away with my children. My husband has already been killed at the front. They drove me away, and I come back to-day, and now my home, all that I had in the world, monsieur, is gone. They have burnt it. What can I do, monsieur? And we are starving." The babe in her arms began to send forth a thin, lifeless wail. I helped the poor woman to her feet and told her to go to the church, and that I would bring her bundle and some food for her. God above, what despair! The grim track of war in all its damnable nakedness was epitomized in this little French hamlet. Houses burnt, horses taken away, agricultural implements wilfully smashed, fruit trees and bushes cut down, even the hedges around their little gardens, their cemetery violated and the remains of their dead strewn to the four winds of heaven, their wells polluted with garbage and filth, in some cases deliberately poisoned, in others totally destroyed by dynamite, their churches used as stables for horses and for drunken orgies, all the younger men deported, and the prettiest of the girls. In some cases their clothes had been forcibly taken away from them, and sacks had been given in exchange to clothe themselves with. They were robbed of every penny they possessed. But when the wonderful sound of the British guns and the tramp of our soldiers crept nearer and nearer, terrifying, relentless and irresistible, the Germans left, fleeing with their ill-gotten spoil like demons of darkness before the angels of light, leaving in their trail the picture I have unfolded to you. Wishing to push on further, I scouted round the outskirts of the village. In a wood a short distance away, it was evident that our patrols were in contact with the Huns. Volley after volley of rifle fire rang out, and now and then a burst from the machine guns. A horseman was heading straight for me. Was he British or Hun? In a few minutes I could see he was one of our men, evidently a dispatch rider. He swept down into a hollow, then up the road into the village. He was riding hard. His horse stumbled, but by a great effort the rider recovered himself. He dashed past me, and clattering over the fallen masonry, disappeared from sight. I looked around. Not a sign of life anywhere, so I decided to make for Vraignes, about a kilometre distant southeast of Bovincourt. I had previously heard from one of the villagers that there were about 1,000 people left there. Strapping my camera on my back, I tramped away, my man following in the rear. The still man, who had left me after feeding the villagers, had been prowling around getting pictures. Accidentally he ran into me, so together we trekked off. Taking advantage of every bit of cover possible, as German snipers were none too careful as to where they put their bullets, we eventually reached the outskirts of Vraignes. Not a sign of Germans, but crowds of civilians. Things here were the same as at Bovincourt, but a few more houses were left standing, owing to the fire not completely doing its work. The people were in the same state. We had just got into the village and near the mairie, when a commotion round the corner by the church attracted my attention. The men and women who had crowded around us shouting with joy turned and rushed up the road. "Vive les Anglais! Vive les Anglais!" The cry was taken up by everyone. Hands and handkerchiefs were waving in all directions. "Vive les Anglais! Vive les Anglais!" "Our boys are there," I said. My camera was up and turned on to the corner where the crowd stood, and at that moment a troop of our cyclists entered, riding very slowly through the exultant people. The first British troops to enter the village. I turned the handle. The scene was inspiring. Cheer after cheer rent the air. Old men and women were crying with joy. Others were holding their babies up to kiss our boys. Children were clinging and hugging around their legs until it was impossible for them to proceed further. The order was given by the officer in charge to halt. The men tumbled off their machines. The people surged round them. To say the men were embarrassed would be to put it mildly. They were absolutely overcome. I filmed them with the crowd around, and then an order was given to take up the billets. Patrols were thrown out, sentries posted, the men parked their cycles and rested. On a large double door of a barn the Huns had gone to the trouble of painting in huge letters the hackneyed phrase, "Gott strafe England," and immediately our men saw it, one of them with a piece of chalk improved upon it. They gathered the children round them and formed a group beneath the letters with German trophies upon their heads. I filmed them there, one of the happiest groups possible to conceive. I left them and went to find the officer in charge, and asked him for the latest news from other sections. "I couldn't say," he replied, "but my men were well in touch with them early this morning. But you seem to know more about it here than anyone else. When on earth did you arrive in the village?" "Just before you," I replied. "I came from Bovincourt." "Well, you have got some job. I certainly didn't expect to find anyone so harmless as a photographer awaiting our arrival." The conversation was abruptly stopped by a warning shout from one of the observers on a housetop close by. "Germans, sir!" The officer and I rushed to a gap in the buildings and looked through our glasses, and there, on a small ridge 1,000 yards off, a body of horsemen were seen approaching, riding hard, as if their very lives depended upon it. An order was immediately given to the machine gun company, who had taken up a most advantageous position, and one that commanded most of the country near by. I placed my camera in such a position by the side of a wall that I could see all that was taking place, and if seen myself I could easily pull it under cover. Nearer and nearer they came. They were too far away to photograph. Excitement was intense. Were they coming into the village? If they did, I thought, in all conscience they would get a warm reception, knowing, as I did, the arrangements for its defence. My eyes were fixed upon them. The officer close by was on the point of giving the order to fire when a burst of machine gun fire rang out in the distance. "Our cavalry have got them," said the officer. "We have some strong posts just here. Bosche has fairly run into them. Look, they have their tails up." And they had, for they were running back for all they were worth in the direction of Bierne. Our men were positively disappointed, and I can honestly say I was myself, for the possibilities of a wonderful scene had disappeared. The tension relaxed. Most of the men returned to their billets and quickly made themselves at home with the people. Noticing people going into church, I went up the hill to investigate. As I entered the outer gate, an officer clattered up on horseback, swung himself off, and walked up to me. "Hullo," he said. "I am the doctor. Anything doing here?" "Well," I said, "there might have been just now." I related the happenings of the last 10 minutes. "Have you been to Bovincourt?" "Yes, but the poor devils are too ill for me. I haven't sufficient stuff with me to go round." Another officer ran up. "I say, doctor, for heaven's sake, look in the church here. The place is packed and half of them are ill, God knows what with, and 1 or 2 are dead." "Well, I will look, but I can do nothing until this evening. I have no stuff with me." We went into the church. Heavens, what a sight met our eyes! The atmosphere was choking. It was like a charnel house. Crowds of old men, women, and children of all ages were crowded together with their belongings. They had been evacuated from dozens of other villages by the Huns. Women were hugging their children to them. In one corner an old woman was bathing the head of a child with an old stocking dipped in water. The child, I could see, was in a high fever. There must have been at least 300 people lying about in all directions, wheezing and coughing, moaning and crying. The doctor spoke to one old woman, who had hobbled forward and sank down near a pillar. The doctor bent down and told her that he would bring medicine in the evening. Everybody there seemed to hear that magic word, and scrambled forward begging for medicine for themselves, but mostly for the children. The scene was pitiable in the extreme. I asked one woman where they had come from. She told me from many villages. The Bosche had turned them all out of their homes, then burnt their houses and their belongings. They had walked miles exposed to the freezing cold rains and winds. They had been packed into this church like a lot of sheep without covering, without fires. She was begging for medicine for her 3-month-old babe. "She will die, monsieur, she will die," and the poor woman burst into a flood of tears. I calmed her as much as possible by telling her that everything would be done for them without delay, and that medicine, food, and comfort would be given them. I turned and left the building, for the air was nearly choking me. Outside I met the doctor, who was arranging to send a cyclist back for an ambulance. "They cannot be treated here, it's impossible. I have never seen such a sight." I left him and went into the house where the cyclist C.O. had made his temporary headquarters. "I want to get on further. Is there any other village near by?" "Yes," he said, "there is Haucourt, but I believe Bosche is in part of it, or he was this morning. It's about 2 kilos from here. I shouldn't go, if I were you, unless you get further information. I am expecting another patrol in from there. If you care to wait a few minutes, you may learn something." I agreed to wait. The still man came in just then, and he agreed to come with me. "We may as well risk it," I said. "I will take my old bus into the place. If Bosche sees it, he may mistake it again for an armoured car." So, packing the cameras aboard, I waited for the expected patrol to turn up. Half an hour passed. No sign. Daylight was waning. "I am going on," I said to the still man. "We cannot wait for the patrol, there's not time. Will you come?" "Yes," he said. I told the C.O. of my intention. "It's thundering risky," he said. "You're going into new ground again." I left Vraignes and advanced at a cautious pace in the direction of Haucourt. Rifle fire was proceeding in the distance, which I judged was the other side of the village. A destroyed sugar refinery on the left was still smoking. It had been blown up by the Huns, and the mass of machinery was flung and twisted about in all directions. In the village I stopped the car close by a crucifix which was still standing. "Turn the car round," I said to my driver, "and keep the engine going. We may have to bolt for it." Then, shouldering the camera, I made my way up the main street. The place was a mass of smoking ruins. Absolutely nothing was left. A huge mine had been blown up at a cross road. All trees and bushes had been cut down. A piano, curiously enough, was lying in the roadway. The front had been smashed, and no doubt all the wires were hacked through by some sharp instrument, and the keys had all been broken. The Huns had evidently tried to take it away with their other loot, but finding it too heavy for quick transport, had abandoned, then willfully destroyed it to prevent its being used by others. The place was as silent as the grave. I filmed a few scenes, which appealed to me, and was on the move towards the further end of the road when two of our cyclists suddenly came into view. I hurried up to them. "Any news?" I asked. "Where's Bosche?" The men were half dead with fatigue. Their legs were caked inches thick in mud, and it was only by a tremendous effort that they were able to lift their feet as they walked. They were pushing their cycles. The mud was caked thick between the wheels and the mud guards, forming in itself a break on the tires. Fagged out as they obviously were, they tried to smile at the reply one made. "Yes, the Bosche is about here, outside the village," said one. "We had a small strong point last night over there," pointing in the distance. "Myself and two pals. We were sitting in the hole smoking when 9 Bosches jumped in on us. Well, sir, they managed to send my pal west, but that's all. Then we started, and 6 Fritzes are lying out there now. The other 3 escaped. It made my blood boil, sir, when they did in my pal. I'm going to make a wooden cross and then bury him. We had been together for a long time, sir, and, well, I miss my pal, but we got 6 for him, and more to come, sir, more to come before we've finished." I thanked the man and sympathized with him over his loss, and complimented him on his fight. "But it's not enough yet, sir, not enough." The two then struggled away, bent on their errand of making a cross for a pal. And as they disappeared among the ruins, I wondered how many men in the world could boast of such a true friend. Very few, worse luck. The sharp crack of a rifle quickly brought me back to earth. A bullet struck the wall close by. I dived under cover of some bricks, dragging my camera after me. Another came over, seeming to strike the spot I had just vacated. I decided to keep the ruins between myself and the gentle Bosche. Scenes were very scarce. No matter where one looked, it was just ruins, ruins, ruins. I wandered on until I came to a long black building, evidently put up by the Huns. It was quite intact, which to me seemed suspicious. It might hide a German sniper. I put my camera behind a wall, then quietly edged near the building. Not a sound was audible. In case anyone was there, I thought of a little ruse. The door was close to me, and it opened outwards. So, picking up a stone, I flung it over the roof, intending it to fall the other end and so create a diversion. With a sudden pull, I opened the door alongside me, but with no result. I peered round the door. Nobody there. I entered and found the building had been used as a stable. Straw was lying all over the place. Feed bags had been hastily thrown down. Halters were dotted here and there, and a Uhlan lance was lying on the ground, which, needless to say, I retained as a souvenir. The rear guard of the enemy had evidently taken shelter there during the previous night, and had made a hasty exit owing to the close proximity of our boys. Evening was drawing on apace, so I decided to make my way back to the car. The still man was awaiting my return. At Bovincourt I met an intelligence officer and told him of my experiences. He seemed highly amused and thanked me for the information brought. I told him that, wishing to be on the spot if anything interesting happened during the night or early next morning, I had decided to sleep in my car in the village. I was going to hunt up a place to cook some food. "I will take you somewhere," he said. "There's the old Mayor of Bierne here. He has been evacuated by the Bosche. He's an interesting old fellow, and you might have a chat with him. He's in a house close by with his wife. Come along." We found the old man in one of the half-dozen remaining houses left intact by the Huns. We entered the kitchen, and my friend introduced us to Paul Andrew, a tall, stately French farmer of a type one rarely sees. He had dark curly hair, a shaggy moustache and beard, blue eyes and sunken cheeks, sallow complexion and a look of despair upon his face, which seemed to brighten up on our entrance. I asked him if his good wife would cook a little food for us, as we wished to stay the night in the village. "Monsieur," he said, "what we have is yours. God knows it's little enough. The Bosche has taken it all. But whatever monsieur wishes, he has only to ask. Will monsieur sit down?" I bade adieu to the officer who had brought us there, had the car run into the yard, and then returned to the cosy kitchen, and sat by the fire whilst the old lady prepared some hot coffee. "These are more comfortable quarters than we expected tonight," I said. "I must make a note of all my scenes taken today. Have you a light, Monsieur Andrew?" "Oui, monsieur, I have only one lamp left, and I hid that, as the Bosche took everything that was made of brass or copper, even the door handles." He brought in the lamp, a small brass one with a candle stuck in it. I proceeded with my record. Then we supped on bread, sardines and bully, sharing our white bread with Andrew and his wife. They had not seen or tasted such wonderful stuff since the Bosche occupation, and their eyes sparkled with pleasure on tasting it again. I had brought copies of the Echo de Paris, Journal, Matin, and other French papers, and these were the first they had seen for 2 years. The farmer declared it was like a man awakening from a long sleep. "We'll turn in," I said. Gathering up my coat, I opened the door. The freezing cold seemed to chill me to the bone, and it was snowing hard. I flashed on my torch and we found our way to the car. Quickly getting inside, I unfolded the seats which formed 2 bunks, and struggling inside our sleeping bags, we were soon asleep. I awoke with a start. It was pitch dark. I rubbed the steam from the door window and looked out. It was still snowing. I had an extraordinary feeling that something was happening, that some danger was near. If anybody had been there near the car, I should have seen them. The snow made that possible. But there was not a sign of movement. I got out of my sleeping bag, thinking that if any prowling Bosche patrol ventured near, I should be able to do something. Nothing happened, and for quite half an hour I was on the alert. Several rifle shots rang out quite near. Then quietness reigned again, and, as nothing else happened, I wriggled into my bag again and dozed. In the morning I told one of our patrol officers of my experience. "You were right," he said. "Uhlan rearguard patrols sneaked in near the village, and must have passed quite close to your place. My men had some shots at them and gave chase, but owing to the confounded snow they got away." I decided that if I slept there again that night, it would be with a rifle by my side. End of Part 2, Chapter 28. Part 2, Chapter 29 of How I Filmed the War, by Geoffrey H. Malins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Before Saint-Quentin. Still the great German retreat continued. Village after village fell into our hands. Mile after mile the enemy was relentlessly pursued by our cavalry and cyclist corps. Still the Germans burnt and devastated everything in their path, although in some instances there was evidence that they were shifted from their lines of defence with far more force and promptitude than they imagined we would put up against them in this particular section. The enemy had arranged his operations as usual by timetable, but he had failed to take into consideration the character of the British soldier, with the result his schemes had gone agley. To save men, the German High Command gave orders for a further retirement to their Hindenburg defences, a fortified line of such strength as had never been equalled. If this line was not impregnable, nothing could be. It was the last word in defence system, and it had taken something like 2 years to perfect. The barbed wire, of a special kind, was formidable in its mass. 3 belts 50 feet deep wound about it in an inextricable mass in the form of a series of triangles and other geometric designs. The trenches themselves were constructional works of art. Switch lines were thrown out as an extra precaution. In front of the most important strategical positions, machine gun posts and strong points abounded in unlimited quantities. It was the Huns' last and most powerful line of defence this side of the Franco-German frontier. This Hindenburg line stretched from a point between Lens and Arras, where it joined the northern trench system, which had been occupied for the past 2 years, down to Saint-Quentin, passing behind the town at a distance of about 5 kilos, with a switch line in front to take the first shock of the Allies' blow when it came. Behind this trench the Huns thought they could safely rest and hold up the Allies' advance. But With their wonderful and elaborate system of barbed wire defence, which they anticipated would keep us out, they probably forgot one point: it would certainly keep them in, tightly bolted and barred. Therefore, under such conditions, it was the side which had the predominance in guns and munitions that could smash their way through by sheer weight of metal, and force a passage through which to pour their troops, taking section by section a series of flanking and encircling movements, threaten their line of communication, finally cracking up the whole line and compel a further extensive falling back to save their armies. Against the front portion of this line we thrust ourselves early in March 1917, and our massed guns poured in the most terrible fire the world had ever known. Lens was practically encircled. The Vimy ridge was taken by assault, and dozens of villages captured, resulting in the capture of 18,000 prisoners and over 200 guns. Hindenburg threw in his divisions with reckless extravagance. He knew that if this section gave way, all hope of holding on to northern France was gone. Time and again he sent forward his cannon fodder in massed formation, targets which our guns could not possibly miss, and they were mown down in countless numbers. His losses were appalling. In certain places his attacking forces succeeded for a time in retaking small sections of ground we had gained, only to be driven out by a strong counter-attack. His losses were terribly disproportionate to his temporary advantage. I moved down to the extreme right of the British line. St. Quentin was the goal upon which I had set my mind. In my opinion, the taking of that place by a combined Franco-British offensive, with the triumphant entry of the troops, would make a film second to none. In the first place, the preliminary operations pictorially would differ from all previous issues of war films, and in the second place it would be the first film actually showing the point of liaison with the French and their subsequent advance, making it, from an historical, public and sentimental point of view, a film par excellence. Therefore, in this section of the British line I made my stand. I left my H.Q. early in April 1917. I intended to live at the line in one of the cellars of a small village situated near the Bois de Orleans, which had been totally destroyed. I proceeded by the main St. Quentin road, through Pouilly into Caulaincourt. The same desolation and wanton destruction was everywhere in evidence, but the most diabolical piece of vandalism was typified by the once beautiful château of Caulaincourt, which was an awful heap of ruins. The château had been blown into the Somme with the object of damming the river, and so flooding the countryside. Partially it succeeded, but our engineers were quickly upon the scene, and soon the river was again running its normal course. The flooded park made an excellent watering place for horses. The wonderful paintings and tapestries in the library on the château had been destroyed. As I wandered among the ruins, filming various scenes of our engineers at work sorting out the débris, I noticed many things which must have been of inestimable value. Every statue and ornamentation about the grounds was wilfully smashed to atoms. The flower pots which lined the edges of the once beautiful floral walks had been deliberately crushed. In fact, a more complete specimen of purposeless wanton destruction it would be impossible to find. I filmed the most interesting sections, then continued my way through Beauvais to see the general of a division. This division was working near the French left. After a very interesting conversation, this officer recommended me to call on a brigadier general. "He is stationed at ," he said. "I will ring him up and tell him you are on the way. He will give you all the map references of the O.P.'s in the neighbourhood. Anyway, you can make your own arrangements, I suppose, about views." "Oh yes, sir, certainly, so long as I can get very near to the place." "Right, you go into all these details with General ." Thanking him, I hurried away. I found the mines which Bosche had exploded at all cross roads very troublesome, and on one occasion, in endeavouring to cross by way of the field alongside, I got badly stuck, so I had to borrow a couple of horses to get me out on to the road again. I duly arrived and reported to Brigadier H.Q. It was the cellar of a once decent house, by the appearance of the garden. I went down 6 steps into a chamber reeking with dampness, about 6 feet high by 10 feet square. A candle was burning in a bottle on a roughly made table, and sitting at it was the General, closely studying details on a map. He looked up as I entered. "Are you the kinema man?" he inquired. "General told me you were coming. What do you want?" "Well, sir," I said, "I want to obtain films of all the operations in connection with the taking of St. Quentin. If you have an observation post from which I can obtain a good view, it will suit me admirably." "I am sure we can fix you up all right. But we are just going to have a meal. Sit down and join us. We can then go into details." Lunch was served in primitive fashion, which was unavoidable under such conditions, but we fared sumptuously, although on a rough plain table with odds and ends for platters, and boxes and other makeshifts for chairs. During the meal I went into details with the General about my requirements. He quite understood my position, and thoroughly appreciated my keen desire to obtain something unique in the way of film story. "The taking of St. Quentin by Allied troops, sir, would be one of my finest films." "Well," he said, "the French are bombarding the suburbs and other places, so far as damage is concerned, to day. Our batteries are also giving a hand. I should advise you to go to this spot," indicating a position on the map. "What do you think?" He turned to the Brigade Major. "Will this do for him?" "Yes, sir, I should think so. Anyway, I can soon see if you can put me on the road to find it, but a guide would save time." "You had better take him," said the General to the Brigade Major. "You know the place quite well." "Right, sir," he said. So, getting hold of an extra orderly to help carry my kit, we started off, up through a wood, and then for the first time I viewed St. Quentin. "We had better spread out here," said my guide. "Bosche can observe all movements from the Cathedral tower, and he doesn't forget to 'strafe' us, although no harm is ever done." "He is crumping now, by all appearances," I replied, noticing some crumps bursting about 300 yards away. "Yes, they are 'strafing' the place we are going to. That's cheerful, anyway. We will make a wide detour. He's putting shrapnel over now. Look out! Keep well to the side of the wood." We kept under cover until it was necessary to cross a field to a distant copse. "That's our O.P. We have some guns there, worse luck." "Hullo, keep down," I said. "That's a burst of 4." Crash, 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 in quick succession the fearful bursts making the ground tremble. "Very pretty," I remarked. "I will get my camera ready for the next lot." They came, and I started turning, one after the other. It was an excellent scene, but as the enemy seemed to swing his range round slightly, the pieces were coming much too near to be healthy. So, hastily packing up, we made straight for the copse on the quarry top. High shrapnel was now bursting, several pieces whistling very unpleasantly near. "Let's get under shelter of the trees," said the Brigade Major. "The trunks will give us a lot of cover." We made a run for it and reached them safely, and gently drawing near the outer edge, I was in full view of St. Quentin. The Cathedral loomed up with great prominence, and shrapnel was exploding near the tower. "That's to keep the Hun observers down," he said. "We are not, of course, shelling the place to damage it at all. Those fires you can see there are of Bosche making. He is systematically burning the place as a prelude to retreat. My intelligence officer says that the Palace of Justice and the theatre are well alight, and airmen declare the town quite empty. They flew over it yesterday only about 200 feet above the housetops, and they were not fired at once. Seems to me they've evacuated the populace entirely." "Jove," I said, "the French are letting them have it over there," pointing in the distance. "That is, of course, south of the town, very nearly running due east and west. It's an excellent barrage, and all H.E. too." I soon got my camera into action, and carefully concealing the tripod behind a tree trunk, or rather a little to one side, I began exposing. The firing was very heavy. I continued exposing on various sections, which gave me the most comprehensive idea of barrage fire. "The French are bang up against the Hindenburg line there, and it's pretty deep in wire, as you know," said my guide, "but I think they will manage it all right. It's only a matter of time. Hullo! They are strafing their confounded guns again with H.E. Look out! Keep down!" And keep down we did. "Those 5.9 of brother Fritz's are not very kind to one. We had better stay for a few minutes. He may catch us crossing the field." 10 minutes went by. Things were a bit quieter, so hastily packing up we doubled back to the road. "I never did like getting near forward gun position," I said, "but curiously enough my best viewpoints compelled me on many occasions to fix up in their vicinity." We got on to the road without casualties, and in time to see the HLI forming up to leave at dusk for the front line, or the series of strong points which comprised it in this section. They were having the operation orders read out to them by their officer in charge. The scenes made very interesting ones for me. The men, alert and keen to the last degree, stood there in line, listening intently to the words until the end. The next morning I had a wire from H.Q. asking me to take charge of 2 French journalists for a day or two. They were most anxious to see the British troops in action before St. Quentin. Towards midday they arrived, M. Gustave Babin, of l'Illustration, Paris, and M. Eugène Tardeau, of the Echo de Paris. I presented these gentlemen to the General, who kindly extended every facility to them. I took them up to the observation post from which they could look down on St. Quentin. "It will be a great moment for me," said M. Babin, "to obtain the first impression of the Allied entry in the town." For myself the day was quite uneventful, beyond obtaining extra scenes of the preparatory work of our artillery. The heavy bombardment was continuing with unabated fury. The horizon was black with the smoke of bursting high explosives. Huge masses of shrapnel were showering their leaden messengers of death upon the enemy. Towards evening the weather changed for the worse. It began with a biting cold sleet, which quickly turned into snow. That night we slept in an old greenhouse which was open to the 4 winds of heaven. The cold was intense. I rolled myself up tight in my bag and drew my waterproof ground sheet well over my body. It was a good job I did so, for the snow was blowing in through the many fissures and cracks and settling upon me like fallen leaves in autumn. The heavy shelling continued throughout the night. Several Bosche shells came unpleasantly near, shaking my rickety shelter in an alarming manner. The next day the weather continued vile, and the operations were indefinitely postponed. Therefore there was nothing further to do but to return to H.Q. St. Quentin for the present was to me a blank, although I had continued for some time preparing all the scenes leading up to its capture. The weather was changing, the ground was drying. Our line just north of the town was being pushed further forward. Olon-Salency, Francy-Salency, Fayet and Villerete had fallen to our victorious troops, but the main attack was not yet. To obtain scenes of our men actually in the front line trenches facing the town, I made my way through Savy and Savy Wood, in which not a single tree was left standing by the Bosche. Through the wood I carefully worked forward by keeping well under cover of a slight rise in the ground. I met a battalion commander on the way who kindly directed me to the best path to take. "But be careful and keep your head down. Hun snipers are very active and he is putting shrapnel over pretty frequently. Although it doesn't hurt us, it evidently amuses him," he said with a smile. "There is one section where you will have to run the gauntlet, for you are in full view of the lines. Keep down as low as possible." I thanked the CO. and went ahead. The weather was now perfect. A cloudless blue sky, flecked here and there by the furry white balls of our bursting shrapnel around Hun aeroplanes, keeping them well above observation range. I noticed a flight of our men winging their way over enemy lines. I could hear the rapid fire of the Bosche anti-aircraft guns and see their black balls of shrapnel burst. But our birdmen went on their way without a moment's hesitation. I recalled the time when I was up among the clouds, filming the Bosche lines 13,000 feet above Mother Earth. Suddenly a sharp crack, crack and whirr of a machine gun rang out. A fight was going on up there. Our anti-aircraft guns ceased, being afraid of hitting our own men, but the Bosche still kept on. It was impossible to see the progress of the fight. The whole flock was now directly overhead. Watching the "strafe" with such keen interest, this point quite escaped me until pieces of shrapnel began to fall around in alarming proportions, causing me to beat a hasty retreat out of range, though I still hung about in hope of a Bosche machine being brought down, thereby providing me with a thrilling scene. But it did not happen. The airmen disappeared in a southerly direction, still fighting until the sharp cracks of the guns droned away in the distance. In a few minutes I came in full view of one of our strong points in the shape of a disused quarry. Around the inner limb our Tommies had made a series of funk holes, which looked quite picturesque in the bright sunlight. Machine gun parties were there, ready for anything that might turn up. In the far corner a group of Frenchmen were chattering volubly to a knot of our men. This certainly was a most interesting scene, the point of liaison between the two great armies, France and Britain. I noticed by fresh shell holes that Bosche had a rather bad habit of annoying the place with his pipsqueaks, but generally they only resulted in scoring a Blighty for more or one of the occupants, and for others they were a source of amusement in the shape of gambling on the spot the next one would fall. I filmed various sections here, then, having partaken of a little tea, I wended my way to the trenches. I kept low as the tower of the cathedral was in full view. I had previously covered the aluminium head of my tripod with a sandbag to prevent it glistening in the sun. As I drew nearer to the trench, which I could now see quite distinctly, more and more of St. Quentin came into view. Such a picture gives one rather a queerish feeling. If a keen-eyed Hun observer spotted me with my load, he would take me for a machine gunner or something equally dangerous. But fortunately nothing happened. I dropped into the trench of the Worcesters, who were amazed and amused to see me there, as one of them said, "Well, sir, I always thought all the war pictures were fakes, but now I know they're not. Will you take us, sir? We expect to go over tonight. Please do, sir. Our people at home will then in all probability see us. Don't suppose I shall. I have an idea I shan't. But," he said, pulling himself together, "I hope so, you know, sir." I liked the man's spirit. It caused all the others to smile. I carefully fixed up my machine and filmed them, holding our front line. "How close is this to the town?" I asked. "About 900 yards, sir." Whether or not Bosche had seen movement I don't know, but suddenly a group of 4 5.9 came crashing over. Everybody ducked. Wise plan, rather, out here. They fell and burst about 50 yards behind us. I awaited the next lot. They came very shortly and fell in almost the same place. Before he shortens the range, I thought, I'll move, and suiting the action to the word, I moved out towards the Bois de Savy and was half way there when another lot burst in my direction. This time I made for the Bois de Ornon, and fortunately the shells ceased. As I reached the furthest side of the Bois de Savy, several tear shells came whistling over and burst just behind me. Needless to say, I had fallen flat, and as I arose the sweet smell of tear gas made itself evident. Not intending to risk a repetition of my previous experience at Beaumont-en-Mel, I closed my eyes and ran like well, you couldn't see me for dust. Yard by yard we continued to press back the enemy. For me the film story of the taking of St. Quentin is an obsession. It holds me as a needle to a magnet, and in this section, at the present, I remain, waiting and watching. My leave is fast running out, and I am nearing the end of my story. In all the pictures that it has been my good fortune to take during the 2½ years that I have been kept at work on the great European battlefield, I have always tried to remember that it was through the eye of the camera, directed by my own sense of observation, that the millions of people at home would gain their only first hand knowledge of what was happening at the front. I have tried to make my pictures actual and reliable. Above all, I have striven to catch the atmosphere of the battlefield, and whilst I have dwelt as little as possible upon its horrors, I have aimed at showing the magnificent spirit which imbues our fighting men, from the highest in command to the humblest unit in the ranks. I am proud to think that the task of doing this has been mine, and in doing it I have tried to do my bit for the land that gave me birth. The End. End of Part 2, Chapter 29. End of How I Filmed the War, by Geoffrey H. Malins.